Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed Ministries Wednesday morning book study. Right now we're going through The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. And this week we are looking at part 2 of our of chapter 4, where science meets faith. And I've decided to break this chapter up into 3 parts. I know that so far we've had a couple of series within this book, but again, as always, I want to make sure that we cover the material well and that we cover the material thoroughly. And I want to make sure that we cover the material as best as is reasonably possible. So, so that everybody gets what they need from this and it brings glory to God. So let's get right into this study. Last week we saw in part 1, we learned who Stephen C. Meyer is, the author of Darwin's Doubt and some other books, as well as seeing the arguments we saw what the study of origins is, what that means, and we saw the idea of the Big Bang. We saw basically that science is pointing to a designer. We've already seen through this series on Case for a Creator, we've already seen that naturalistic arguments fail. But as I was saying the whole time we were going through that part of the series, that isn't where the argument can end. If the argument ends there, then you might say, okay, so there's not a naturalistic theory, but you don't have, you could say you don't have anything to counter it with. You're just showing that this theory doesn't work. But we're now seeing that there is something to counter it with. To quote, again, this is not an argument from ignorance, Myers insisted. We're not inferring design just because natural evolutionary theories all fail to explain the information. We infer design because these fails theory, and we know of another causal entity that is capable of producing information, namely intelligence. So we've been seeing that not only is there good reason to reject naturalistic theories based on good scientific reason, but there's also good scientific reason to think that design is true. And some of the things that we talked about with that were the Big Bang, fine-tuning, and the complexity of the cell. So today we're going to continue with part 2, where we're going to see more examples, and we're going to discuss the God hypothesis. So before we dive right in, I do want to remind you guys to please follow the links in the description below. If you love what we're doing here, please consider supporting Freed Indeed Ministries. But I also want to remind you guys about supporting the Orthodox Diocese of Alaska, the oldest, the jewel of the West. It is the oldest Orthodox diocese in the New World. It is the Jerusalem of the New World, so to speak, because it is through them that all of us have been able to become Orthodox. And so I always urge Orthodox Christians in the New World to do what we can to remember those who are poor in our Jerusalem, just as the early Christians were urged to remember the poor in the Jerusalem of the Old World. So please do consider that task. Now let's dive into it. So this is actually my wife Cheryl's favorite argument, the argument from irreducible complexity. Let's take a look at what Stephen Meyer has to say about it. Continuing on to the fourth example, Meyer said, then there's the evidence for design in molecular machines that defy explanation by Darwinian natural selection. These integrative, complex systems in biological organisms, which microbiologist Michael Behe calls irreducibly complex, include signal transduction circuits, sophisticated motors, and all kinds of biological circuitry. So, like I said, this is Cheryl's favorite argument, and a good example of this irreducible complexity is the cellular flagella. And so what the cellular flagella is, you can see a little diagram I have here that shows it. It's like a little tail that whips around and enables propulsion. But here's the thing, the reason why this is called irreducibly complex is because this is referring to a system that is completely useless until it is complete. So because of that, it defies naturalistic explanation, especially Darwinian naturalistic explanation, because there's no way that a system like this could develop through the slow evolutionary process that the theory of evolution, the theory of macroevolution ascribes. Instead, it would have to come into existence at a particular point in time, because without that, you couldn't have these complex systems. These complex systems defy Darwinian explanation. This is actually not a new argument, though. It is somewhat new to get down to the sort of microscopic level, but an argument that you might be more familiar with that follows the same line of reasoning is the argument from the eye. Which this is actually one of my mom's favorite arguments. I don't think my mom is quite on the level of being a creationist. I think that she tends to be more of, she tends to buy into a lot more of the evolutionary perspective, but nevertheless, this is the argument that she finds the most compelling, and that is the argument from the eye. The eye is an example from our own anatomy, because needless to say, we don't have a flagella, but we do have our eye, and our eye is something that couldn't have evolved. And it couldn't have evolved from something simpler, because every step of that process, you would have had something completely non-functional. And there have been attempts to refute this argument, but these attempts always fall short, for the simple reason that it is simply true that our eye, not just our eyes, but the sight organ in animals that have sight organs are too complex to have evolved over time, because you need the ocular nerve, and you need the ocular nerve to connect to the occipital lobe, or to the you need it to connect to the brain. And actually, interestingly enough, you need it to connect to the brain in such a way that your eyes are actually projecting an image upside down into the brain, and then the brain projects that image back right side up within itself. So at each step of this process is a separate but related organ. So you have your eyes, and then you have the ocular nerve, and then it connects to the brain in the back of the skull, actually, and then that connects forward to other parts of your brain to form memory and other things. So all of this, each step of this process is useless without the whole process. There is no way that Darwinian evolution can account for this. There's no way that macroevolution can account for this, because as Todd Friel famously asks to a group of evolutionists, he asked which came first, the eyes, the ocular nerve, or the parts of the brain that uh, interpret the vision, because none of these are functional until the whole system is functional. So that's the problem. Now, let's go through some attempts to refute this. In the case of the eye, um, there's a couple of ways that people try to refute it. And these are all variations on really the same argument, or I'll be generous and say they're variations on two similar arguments. So one argument that's really common is to look at octopus eyes, cat eyes, other animals' eyes, and then human eyes, and say, well, humans don't have the best eyes in the animal kingdom, therefore they can't be the result of design. Sometimes you'll see this argument mocked as, if God real, why octopus have good vision? But it is an argument that is actually made in certain atheistic circles, so I'm going to refute it. Basically, what this argument boils down to is that it's working off of the Christian assumption that humans are made in the image of God, and then saying that that can't be true because there's other animals that have quote unquote better vision. Couple flaws with that argument. One flaw with that argument is that octopuses also don't have noses like we do. So and they don't have to compensate for the amount of light that we take in from the sun. An octopus lives underwater, so it's not having to compensate for that, and it's also not having to compensate for having a nose. Our vision, our eyes are perfectly suited to do those two tasks. Their eyes are not, because they don't need to be. So, similarly, cats hunt at night, and as a result, their eyes have to be much better at seeing in the dark than ours do. Our eyes don't have to be as good at seeing in the dark because our circadian rhythm is designed perfectly for us to be able to sleep through the night. Now, that's not true of everyone. Some people have sleep disorders and all this, but those things result from the fall. Those things, the fact that there are sleep disorders and all this, that's not the way God originally created the universe to be. But that is the world we live in now. But disordered existence doesn't disprove the general rule. So the general rule is that we're created with a circadian rhythm that is designed for us to be awake during the day when it's light and asleep at night when it's dark. Therefore, we don't need our eyes to adjust to the same level that cats do. And so we don't have that. So are our eyes worse than other creatures' eyes? No. Our eyes are perfectly suited to the function that God has given to us, which is to be his image bearers in the world, ruling and reigning over creation. This is how our eyes are designed. Our eyes are designed perfectly to suit that function. Another another way of trying to refute this argument from the eye is to say that our eyes are to point out imperfections in vision or some other stupid thing. So like sometimes you'll see atheists talk about, well, if if Christianity is true and this argument from intelligent design is true, then how come you have to wear spectacles? Ha ha ha, checkmate Christians. And it's just dumb because the fact that somebody might have to wear spectacles is not an argument against the perfect design of the eye. Once again, disorders don't disprove the natural rule. The natural rule was that in creation the eye would have functioned perfectly. but also, more importantly, the fact that we can see at all is actually what this argument is rooted in. The fact that we have organs that are capable of this function, and that the way in which those organs work is not something that could have evolved gradually, because any theory about how it could have evolved gradually falls flat from the fact that this requires an irreducibly complex system of sight. So, basically what I'm saying is that all of these arguments from the imperfection in the eye or whatever, they all completely miss the point, because our point is not that humans have the most optimum conceivable method of seeing. The point is that humans can in fact see, and that the method in which we do in fact see is one that could not have evolved over time, because it is irreducibly complex. But now we get to the microscopic example, and the microscopic example is interesting because, to my view, this is even more compelling than the argument from the eye. And the reason it's even more compelling is because now you get to these microscopic organisms, and you still find that even in these microorganisms, single cell organisms, there are nevertheless these irreducibly complex systems. And these irreducibly complex systems, again, cannot function until the whole system is complete. So here's an excellent example of this in the flagellum. The problem with irreducibly complex systems is that they perform no function until all the parts are present and working together in close coordination with one another. So natural selection cannot help you build such systems. It can only preserve them once they've been built. And it's virtually impossible for evolution to take such a huge leap by mere chance to create the whole system all at once. Of course, this forces the question, how did the biochemical machines arise? Behe says that maybe these biological systems look designed because they really are designed. After all, whenever we see irreducibly complex systems, we know how they arose. Invariably, a designer was the cause. So these are systems that are not functional until they are complete, and they exist even on the microscopic level. Now, sometimes we've seen weak objections to this argument. So one of these is, well, I can make a simple one of these is, you say, okay, so a mouse trap is an irreducibly complex system because I have to have the block of wood, the spring, and the hammer. I have to have all of these in order for the mousetrap to work. If I don't have any one of these things, then all the rest are useless. Now, that was an analogy that was used, and then somebody picked apart the analogy by saying, I can make a simpler mousetrap using or a more complex mousetrap. So you can make a simpler one that maybe just has like the spring and something else or whatever, and then you can make a more complex one that takes the same kind of system but makes it more American by having it have a 6-shooter pistol that blasts the mouse into oblivion. Those are both options, and so this is supposed to somehow disprove that the mousetrap that we in fact do possess is irreducibly complex. The issue with this objection is that that's not the question. The question isn't whether you could build a simpler flagellum. The question is whether the flagellum that actually exists in the microorganism could have arisen, or whether it could function without all of its constituent parts. So in this analogy, and that's all it is an analogy, but in this analogy, the question isn't, can you build a simpler mousetrap? Of course you can. The question is, could the mousetrap that actually exists function if you removed any of its components? And the answer is no. So the mousetrap that actually exists in this picture is a mousetrap that is irreducibly complex because it cannot be, no element of it can be removed without making it cease to be functional. In the same way, no element of the flagellum could be removed without the flagellum becoming completely useless. There's an even weaker argument that sometimes gets presented that says maybe some of the components had other functions before. The problem is they don't. Simply put, these things don't produce any function until you have the full organism, until you have the fully formed function. But more importantly, this actually doesn't work with macroevolution either, because if you take all of these separate parts, stick them in different places to serve different functions, you still have to account for why they all end up in the same place together to create a flagellum. And so once again, though, what this argument proves is that evolution is the theory of the gaps. In other words, they say there is no explanation that makes sense of how the flagellum can work naturalistically, but someday we'll find one. And that is the theory of the gaps, or maybe there was some function. Well, the problem is we can't see any way in which there was a function, so you have to assume that there's some gap, and that is the theory of the gaps. Again, evolution is the theory of the gaps, intelligent design is the theory of the facts. So let's move on to our next argument. So our next argument is from the Cambrian explosion. Now remember, we saw before that the Cambrian explosion was one of the best arguments against the Darwin tree of life. But this isn't just a good argument against Darwinism. Stephen Meyer says it's a good argument for faith. So Lee Strobel mentions that Jonathan Wells had already explained that the biological Big Bang was a good argument against Darwinism, to which Stephen Meyer says, indeed it is. You have between 20 and 35 completely novel body plans that come online in the Cambrian explosion. You also have a huge jump in complexity. It's sudden, and you have no transitional intermediates. However, this is also a good affirmative evidence for design, because in our experience, information invariably is the result of a conscious activity. Here we have geologically sudden infusion of a massive amount of new biological information to create these body plans, far beyond what Darwinist mechanisms can produce. Darwinism simply can't account for it, but design can, and is a better explanation. Think about how we suddenly see new body plans emerged. As one paleontologist said, quote, "What I want to know from my biology friends is just how fast does evolution have to happen before we stop calling it evolution," end quote. Darwin said that nature takes no sudden leaps, but here's a huge leap, which is what intelligent agents cause. Consequently, the Cambrian explosion provides not just a negative case against Darwinian evolution, but also a compelling positive argument for design. So this is not just a good case against Darwinism, it's actually a good case for design. In fact, I mentioned before, and we saw last week, that the first Big Bang, so to speak, is a great argument for intelligent design. But there's actually four Big Bangs that you have to account. You have to account for these four Big Bangs in order to come up with a naturalistic theory, you have to come up with a naturalistic way of accounting for these things. Whereas in the argument from design, these things are designed, and therefore the theory of design accounts for these four Big Bangs because of the nature of the theory. So let's go through them. We've already seen the Big Bang, talked about it last week. Now we're looking at the existence of life at all. This is the so this is one. This is another Big Bang, is the existence of life. How do we go from non-living organisms to living organisms? I talked about that. Excuse me. I talked about that with the Stanley Miller experiment. When I was refuting the claims of the Stanley Miller experiment, I talked about the fact that you have to somehow account for us going from non-living organisms to living organisms, and the fact that there's no naturalistic theory that can account for this, because again, even if the Stanley Miller experiment actually proved what it claimed to prove, you would still be a long way from producing a living organism. You would have a single protein molecule, not a living organism. And in the astronomical absurdity of thinking that these protein molecules are then going to line up perfectly and then start replicating themselves makes no sense. But we saw that the Stanley Miller experiment was actually built on a faulty foundation, and there actually is no way that um that even that simplest of explanations could, or even that simplest of starting points could have arisen by naturalistic means. So the existence of life, whereas the existence of life makes sense if there's a designer, because a designer could line up those protein molecules perfectly in the exact way that they needed to, in the same way that, say, you or I build a computer. Next, you have the diversity of life, which is the Cambrian or biological Big Bang. That's what we've just been talking about. The fact that you have all of this sudden onset of information packed into living organisms. Now, the fourth Big Bang that you'd have to account for is the idea of human consciousness, the conscious Big Bang. Now, this is another area where there is simply no evidence of gradual development, and so each requires a bang, and this cannot be accounted for in Darwinistic theory. It can only be accounted for through the theory of intelligence. But let's get into human consciousness, because I think this argument is really interesting. So, page 97, Meyer said, I would say human consciousness certainly supports the theistic view of human nature. Judaism and Christianity clearly teach that we're more than just matter. We're not a computer made of meat, in the words of Marvin Minsky, but we're instead made in God's image. We have the capacity for self-reflection, for representational art, for language, for creativity. Science cannot account for this kind of consciousness merely from the interaction of physical matter in the brain. Where did it come from? Again, I think this provides the best I think theism provides the best explanation. So, you know, Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. I'm saying, I think, therefore God is, because apart from the theory of intelligent design, there really isn't any good argument for why we have consciousness, true consciousness. Why are we more than mere instinct? Why do we have free will? Free will being the ability to choose between two contrary choices. We don't just make choices based purely on instinct. We make choices based on what we desire. We make choices based on what we value, based on values that we hold that might be contrary to our desires. I might desire to have sexual intercourse with a given woman, but I value my relationship to my wife and the exclusive relationship that she and I share as husband and wife becoming one flesh. And so, because of that value, I don't give in to the desire. Which, by the way, that contradicts both the atheistic worldview and it contradicts the deterministic worldview, because determinists also believe that we don't have free will and that we only go along with desire. But this is simply not true. We are more than the sum of our parts. In fact, we're so much more than the sum of our parts that scientists who study the brain have done research where they've used electrical shocks into the brain to cause people to move in different ways, to cause they showed that they could cause a man to move his arm by electrocuting his brain in a certain way. But what was so interesting is that when the man was asked, he said that when he was asked if he moved his arm, he said no. And the reason why the answer was no is because they moved his arm and he did not will his arm to move. It moved involuntarily. Therefore, he didn't move it because he was not the one in control of it moving. So, if I choose to flip a light switch and I flip the light switch, then I have made a free will choice. If you, through some kind of electric impulses, cause my hand to move in the same motion that it does when I flip on a light switch, I haven't flipped the light switch. You have. And this proves that there is more going on than just electrical impulses. Because if it was just electrical impulses, then the man would have seen no difference between when he chooses to move his arm and when the scientists doing the study moved his arm. But there was a difference, and that difference was his free will. So our God is the God of science, the God of the facts, not the God of the gaps. On page 98, we read, first, theism with its concept of a transcendent creator provides a more causally adequate explanation for the Big Bang than a naturalistic explanation can offer. The cause of the universe must transcend matter, space, and time, which were brought into existence with the Big Bang. The reason why that has to be is because if you have time but you don't have matter, then where do you put it? If you have matter but you don't have time, when would you put it? If you have matter but you don't have space, then where is the matter found? If you have space but you don't have matter, then what is occupying the space? If you have space but you don't have time, then when is the space? If you have time but you don't have space, then where is the time? So these are questions that cannot be answered. So therefore, the cause which creates the universe must transcend matter, space, and time, because all of these things have to come into existence together. And thanks to the Big Bang, we now know that they did in fact come into existence. Anyway, I digress. The Judeo-Christian God has precisely this attribute of transcendence. Yet naturalism, by definition, denies the existence of any entity beyond the closed system of nature. The fine-tuning of the physical laws and constants of the universe and the precise configuration of its initial conditions dating back to the very origin of the universe itself suggests the need for a cause that is intelligent. Theism affirms the existence of just such an entity, not only as a transcendent being, but as an intelligent one as well, namely God. Thus, theism can account both for the Big Bang cosmology and anthropic fine tuning. So, God is the facts. God is the God of the facts, not the God of the gaps. And I just want to point out that very often when we talk about God in this way, people say, no, there must be a rational explanation. And this is the same thing people say when you talk about the paranormal. No, it can't be ghosts. There must be a quote unquote rational explanation. Well, here's what I would respond. My response is that God is the rational explanation. You're saying there has to be a rational explanation for the cosmos. God is the rational explanation because, as we've seen, every other theory is irrational, and this theory is cogent and rational. And I think the same thing, by the way, about the spirits. When people talk about, oh, there has to be a rational explanation for what's going on in my house. Sometimes, I just start shaking the person. I'm like, the rational explanation is the paranormal. You've exhausted all the other explanations, and you're only saying that this explanation is irrational because you've made that assumption. But if you look around and you see that you're seeing things in the mirror behind you, there's thumps and shadow people and all this stuff, the rational explanation is the paranormal. Stop denying it and stop saying that you need to find a rational explanation. In the same way, this is what many people who claim to be into science do when it comes to God. They say there has to be a rational explanation for the universe, and they ignore that the rational explanation is God. So now, Lee Strobel challenges Stephen Meyer with the idea that what about other systems like pantheism? Can they account for this science? Meyer says pantheism cannot explain the origin of the universe because pantheists believe in an impersonal God that is coextensive with the physical universe. Such a God cannot bring the universe into being from nothing, since such a God doesn't exist independently of the physical universe. If initially the physical universe didn't exist, then the pantheistic God wouldn't exist either. So basically, pantheism cannot account for the Big Bang because pantheism suggests a God that didn't exist prior to the Big Bang, since the pantheistic conception of God is tied to the material universe itself. So pantheism can't get us anywhere. Another theory is deism. Now, in response to deism, Stephen Meyer says this: you see, deism can't explain the evidence of discrete acts of design or creation after the universe was initially created. The deistic God doesn't intervene in nature, yet we're seeing evidence of intelligent design in the history of life. For example, the high information content in the cell is compelling evidence for an act of intelligent design of the first life long after the beginning of the universe. Now, some deists will object to that because there are deists who believe that God does intervene in sort of the processes of life, and that this is kind of a caricature of deism. And they only don't believe that God intervenes in a physical way in history. So what that means is like so for example, Thomas Paine was a deist, and Thomas Paine believed that the God of creation, the deist God, was intervening to make America into a country. But he also believed that those interventions would be sort of invisible and masked and behind the scenes, because he didn't believe that God ever intervened in such a way as to be manifest. Um, at the end of the day, I don't really understand the point of deism. I don't see the point of believing in a deistic conception of God, since that God wouldn't care about me anyway and wouldn't intervene in my life. So what's the point of even bothering to worship such a useless deity? But ultimately, I would refuse deism. I would refute deism by simply noting that it is nothing more than Enlightenment philosophy applied to religion. Um, Deism is Enlightenment philosophy because it assumes that science and reason can account for everything under the sun. Um, but here's the thing. Well, this whole book club is about showing you that science can point you to God. Um, it is also simply a fact that science cannot tell you everything that you need to know. Science and reason by themselves are tools, but they are tools that by their nature are incomplete. They cannot account for everything under the sun. And so ultimately, deism doesn't work because deism is trying to posit that science and reason can account for everything and that nothing can transcend these realities or go beyond them. Jesus, however, is the perfect refutation of deism, because Jesus is God who is incarnate. Jesus is the God who does intervene. He's the God who intervenes so much so that he takes on human nature to himself. Jesus is the proof that deism is false, because Jesus is the God man, the one who became God, or who became man so that men can become like God. Jesus has united himself to us so that we can be united to him. Deism cannot save because deism doesn't understand the problem that man faces. Rightly, deism assumes that we have all of our ducks in a row, so to speak, and our problems are primarily political ones that need to be solved by us in a political way. Jesus shows us that that's not true because he is God and he didn't intervene in politics. He intervened in the lives of people and then built the greatest empire in all of history, the church. And the church is what he's using to fix politics. But he fixes politics by fixing each one of us. We are more you as an individual person are more important to God than the politics of empires is to God, because empires rise and fall. Empires wax and wane. As C.S. Lewis said, empires are mortal, human beings are not. Because what is an empire but the space of a couple hundred years and a few thousand miles? What is a human soul but an eternally living being who can and does live for all eternity and never ceases. So, of course, God cares more about the eternal than about the temporal. And C.S. Lewis was right, because Jesus Christ is the proof. Jesus Christ died and rose again, proving once and for all that deism is a false and insane ideology and that Christianity is true. So let's get back on track. Taken together, what we know today gives us heightened confidence from science that God exists. The weight of the evidence is very impressive. In fact, in my opinion, it is sufficiently conclusive to say that theism provides the best explanation for the ensemble of scientific evidence that we've been discussing. Science and faith are not at war. When scientific evidence and biblical teaching are correctly interpreted, they can and do support one another. I would say to anyone who doubts that, investigate the evidence for yourself. As Werner Heisenberg said, the first gulp of the glass of natural science will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. Science and faith are not foes, they're not enemies. Both are pointing to the same reality, and that is the reality of God. So let's keep going here. So one of the things that I think happens often is that one of the reasons people fall into this trap of thinking that faith and science are at odds with one another is actually because they have a false view of faith. And that view is called fideism. Fideism is not the Christian concept of faith. Basically, fideism is yet another enlightenment idea, or endarkenment, as I call it, idea. And what fideism, the way fideism came about is basically that philosopher Rene Descartes made some really bad arguments for the existence of God. And then what happened is that since those arguments failed, Soren Kierkegaard and some others made the argument that there is no argument for God, that we can't argue for the existence of God because to do so somehow violates faith. And then they said, so God has hidden himself so that we have to have faith in him. The problem I have with fideism is that it really makes no sense. Why would God give us a brain if he didn't want us to use it? That's kind of my argument against fideism. But ultimately, the view of fideism is that if you can in any way understand God or discern him in the world around you, then that's not actual faith. But that's simply not biblical Christianity. In biblical Christianity, we see all sorts of examples of God showing us himself through the natural world. Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth his wisdom. We see that the sun runs his circuit like the athlete, and from one end of the heavens to the other, and nothing escapes his light. And this is an analogy for the Orient from on high, our Lord Jesus Christ, who shows forth his light over all the earth. This is and by the way, Jesus Christ's light also comes from the east. In case I know that right now in American Christianity, it's popular to call Christianity a Western religion, but Jesus's light actually came from the east, not the west, just like the sun. But the point is that fideism can't account for this. Fideism can't account for the fact that when we look out at the glory of creation, we don't say, gee, there's no argument for God here. No, when we look out at the glories of creation, if you stand, we live really close to Multnomah Falls, and I go hiking there all the time. And one of my favorite things to do is just stop along the trail and look out at the glory of the Columbia River and the glory of all the trees and hills and the firmament and everything that I can see. And when I look out at that, I don't see fideism, I see God. So, a better way of examining faith is explained by our text on page 101. It's called Inference to the Best Explanation. This form of practical reasoning that we use in life all the time says if I want to explain a phenomenon or event, I consider a whole range of hypotheses and infer to the one which, if true, would provide the best explanation. In other words, we do extensive analysis of the possible explanations and keep adding information until only one explanation is left that can explain the whole range of data. So for example, this was, you'll remember, my method in the Soul After Death book club. I was not willing in that book club to examine only those stories that were favorable to what I wanted to teach. I said we need to look at all the evidence. Not so we can't just look at near-death experiences where people say things that sound Christian-y and then say, see, Christianity is true. No, you have to look at all the evidence. That includes the testimony of atheists who have near-death experiences, Hindus who have near-death experiences, Jews who have near-death experiences, all of them. And then when we examine all the evidence, including what scripture teaches and what the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches, what all of these things teach, when we examine all the evidence, we use discernment to come to the best explanation. And what we saw was that, interestingly enough, the best explanation when all the evidence was examined is exactly what the Orthodox Church teaches about the journey of the soul after death. In this case, we're asking a different question. We're saying if we examine all of the evidence from the observable universe, the evidence of microbiology, the evidence of astronomy, when we examine all the evidence from the observable universe, what we call science, what is the best explanation to account for this evidence? And what we come to is the argument of design. Stephen Meyer says, we reach conclusions with a high degree of confidence using this form of reasoning in our everyday life. This is what detectives do. This is what lawyers do in court. Scientists also use this approach. This model can enable us to achieve a high degree of practical certainty. And when we look at the evidence I've mentioned from cosmology, physics, biology, and human consciousness, we find that theism has amazing explanatory scope and power. The existence of God explains this broad range of evidence far more simply and adequately and comprehensively than any other worldview, including its main competitors such as naturalism or pantheism. And the discovery of corroborating or supporting evidence is accelerating. By the way, the reason why this is still faith is because faith in Christianity isn't just about knowing the information. You can know the information. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. You can know the information and know that it's pointing in a certain direction and still choose not to believe that because you don't want to. But what we're saying here is that faith is the evidence, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What is faith? Faith is a living relationship with God, not just knowing that evidence points to him. Deists can know that evidence points to God, but they don't have a relationship because they don't even believe that their God is a God you can have a relationship with. Frederick Burnham said, quote, "The God hypothesis is more respectable now than at any time in the last 100 years." I would go a step further. It's more respectable, it's more forceful, and it's more convincing because the God hypothesis actually accounts for the evidence. Now, next week, we're going to do a part 3 of this series in which we will be answering objections. Now, I'm going to be answering the objections that Lee Strobel raises in this book. Excuse me. If you have other objections that you would like to see answered, please comment below with your objections. If you're an atheist or a deist or whatever, and you have objections you want to see answered, ask your questions so that I can answer them in our next session. And if you're watching this after that next session has already been filmed, then I would say by all means, still ask your questions, and I can do another separate, maybe an episode of Freed Indeed Live where I answer the objections. But in the meantime, we've seen macroevolution refuted. We've seen the God hypothesis looking really strong. But I just said faith is not about just believing certain facts. Faith is about building a relationship. And so I'm saying, don't just know that God is out there and has created you. Get to know him. Don't just learn facts about God. Come to know God. Come to the Orthodox Church and ask your local Orthodox priest about joining the Inquirers class, where you can get your questions answered and prepare yourself for baptism into the church so that you can have a relationship with the living God. And every single day, pray this prayer: Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. If you do that, I believe you will have a relationship with the living God. And that's what we should all desire, is to know and love the true God who made us, because that's what he's made us for. So thank you very much for watching. God bless, and please share this with your friends, especially your atheist friends, so that they too can be freed indeed.